Hi, and welcome. Happy New Year to all of you who are watching on our YouTube channel. Thanks so much for joining us. Today, we have a special event in which we will have two MA researchers present their early findings of their master's thesis. It doesn't mean that this is the end all of their master's thesis. It just means that this is what they're working on, and this is what they want to present and share with you. We welcome your questions. Just tap them into the YouTube comments, and I'll be sure to relay those to our presenters today. But without further ado, we will have, they will be introduced by Victoria.
Thank you, Creston. So my name is Victoria. I'm a fellow researcher at GCAS, and it's my honor to introduce the presenters today who are also in the MA program in GCAS. So first, we are going to hear about Ewa Lewandowska's research, and then later Eris D'Eir's research. So what we need to know about them. Ewa Lewandowska's current research interests include consciousness, technology, capitalism, love, ontology, and the real. In her work, Ewa is on the lookout for the profound moments when knowledge brings about an undeniable paradigm shift. Additionally, she's exploring the crossover between philosophy, emancipation, and altered states of consciousness with her breathwork project, absolutenow.org. Ewa holds an MSc in Management, Business Strategy, and Environment from Birkbeck College and a BA in Journalism and Music and Media Management from London Metropolitan University. She spent the last decade working at technology startups in London and New York City. And then we will hear about Eris's research. Eris D'Eir holds a BA in philosophy from GCAS and is a professional circus artist based in Montreal and New York. Eris's research interests converge at the intersection of philosophy and neuroscience, exploring neuroplasticity, agency, neuro-psychological oppression, consciousness, and the phenomenology of danger. Eris is interested in the potential effects of oppression, danger, and risk-taking upon agency and the brain, the examination of post-traumatic stress disorder as a form of systemic oppression and assault on agency, as well as what neuroplasticity research portends with regard to subjectivity and consciousness. So with that, I'm looking forward to the exciting findings and research presentation, and the floor is yours, Ewa.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. So the early working title for my thesis is The Virtual Altar, Commodity, Sacrifice, and the Subject in the Metaverse. And so my objective is to delineate the emerging virtual commercial space known as the metaverse. And what I observed so far is that the metaverse initially appears as a space of pure potential and consequence-free enjoyment, and sacrifice is delegated out of sight into the physical world. But upon closer examination, this virtual space is really interwoven with the sacrifice of its users. And in my research so far, I draw from Metzinger and Chalmers, who write about technology and virtual reality. And I also utilize the work of Todd McGowan, Giorgio Agamben, Christian Fuchs, and Marx. So I will share some thoughts today about the metaverse and the commodity, labor, and sacrifice in this space. So when I say metaverse, I refer to commercial virtual reality infrastructure developed by leading tech companies. So for example, Horizon Worlds by Meta. And I really see it as a new frontier of the advancement of capital. And an example could be a rapid expansion of virtual land sale that reached $2 billion in the last 12 months. And I started my exploration by attempting to understand what virtual means. And in technology, virtual usually means digitally simulated. And in philosophy, it's more often understood as potential. And I find this actually very meaningful and useful here. Metzinger defines technological virtual reality as the representation of possible worlds and possible selves, with the aim of making them appear ever more realistic. And so there is this interesting media rhetoric about the metaverse that captures this sense of possibility and especially a perceived lack of constraints. So we can hear claims such as the metaverse is as expansive as the imagination of its creators, or there will be no limit to what is possible, and this will lead to exponential growth. And I think it's not accidental that this expansive virtual space of possibility is gaining traction right now. So we have this late capitalism struggling with resource scarcity, and we are continuously warned there is no planet B. And in this context, the metaverse emerges as this kind of an attractive alternative, a limitless B space. And I will quote from Todd McGowan, who says that we need both a sufficient distance as well as an unconscious awareness of the worker's sacrifice in order to enjoy a commodity. The labor embodied in the commodity must remain hidden, though we must also maintain an unconscious awareness of it. So we can consider the metaverse as a convenient distraction from the sacrifice of capitalist production. For example, virtual land sale in the metaverse defies legal restrictions, with plots of land available that can be used in any way desired without planning permissions. But everything that has a potential virtual presence has a corresponding physical presence on the finite Earth, starting from requiring energy consumption to access it through data centers, VR hardware, and technology workers developing the experience. And this cost is seemingly removed and placed out of sight, while the metaverse remains as a space of consequence-free, unlimited enjoyment. And then the closer analysis shows that the metaverse worlds are really marked with the sacrifice of the users. So in Christian tradition, we have the world creation occurring ex nihilo, while the commodified digital worlds inevitably always emerge ex laboro. So that brings me to Marx. And in an essay, Marx, or the Universal Exposition, Agamben quotes the guide to the Paris Exposition of 1867. The public needs a grandiose concept that will strike its imagination. Its spirit must halt, astonished, before the marvels of the industry. It wishes to contemplate an enchanted scene and not similar products uniformly grouped. And I think with the metaverse, we encounter this next grandiose imaginative concept, a commodified space filled with enchanted objects, which Marx referred to as an essentially immaterial and abstract piece of goods, whose concrete enjoyment is impossible, except through accumulation and exchange. So from here, I will utilize research of Fuchs to start clarifying the digital and virtual labor and explore the nature of users' sacrifice in the metaverse. Fuchs talks about how capital attempts to commodify disposable time through the emergence of play labor, digital labor, and prosumption. The cause is the imperialistic tendency of capitalism, on one side to create disposable time, on the other to convert it into surplus labor. And he further explains the digital labor in his analysis of Facebook, which we should remember recently turned into Meta, a company that spent $36 billion so far developing commercial virtual worlds. The abstract status of labor and the commodity that cannot be directly experienced by the user is veiled by the pseudo-concreteness of free access to the platform, social benefits, and a playful atmosphere. And due to this crucial social aspect of the metaverse, a subject is never a pure consumer in this space. As further explained by Fuchs, Facebook sells a commodity in which users' attention and personal data is objectified. Users produce this commodity and Facebook exploits them and thereby accumulates capital. And for me, the crucial move of the metaverse is taking this process to the next level, utilizing VR headset and corresponding devices to establish a subjective sense of presence in the commodified digital world. And here I utilize Metzinger's definition of presence as a complex phenomenal quality of 3 dimensions. identification, self-location in a temporal frame of reference, and self-location in space. So in this way, immersive commercial virtual reality allows capital not only to create disposable time that can be commodified, but also disposable space, effectively progressively turning presence into a commodity. And I think this disposable space is very useful for capital's future expansion as it encounters resource scarcity on Earth. Behind the veil of free access, social benefits, and a playful atmosphere, a metaverse user emerges as a worker who is nevertheless not perceived as important in the digital age class struggle and not considered a true worker. Not only do they not receive compensation for their labor, but they pay for commodities, such as the VR headset, that will then commodify their presence as laborers, providing them with a new way to sacrifice themselves. And so I'm just finishing up, but I think suddenly we are finding ourselves on a very political territory, and we can see how this environment contributes to a division between, this is again quoting Fuchs, wage workers in the non-digital economy who remain seen as a true locus of power, and then on the other side, subjects interacting in the metaverse, which are still perceived as mere consumers who are just enjoying and not participating in the shared struggle. Thank you.
Thank you, Ewa. And now Eris will be up next. And if you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the comment section and I'll relay them to our presenters. Thanks a lot. And Eris is in Montreal. How's it going, Eris?
Going well. Finally snowing.
Right. Nice, nice. Of course, Montreal. Perfect.
Okay, I guess I'll get started. So my interest in my research topic originated from an observation of this strange dichotomy where people with PTSD exhibit very risky behaviors, like danger-seeking behaviors, which is counterposed with a tendency towards indifference as a symptom of the condition. When contextualized against this growing state of apathy and depression in modern society, suffering from loss of meaning, I wanted to examine the common vernacular surrounding risky behaviors and danger as maladaptive, and to further examine the relationship between danger, meaning, and being. To be requires courage. It requires, by many philosophical standpoints, the courage to wonder and persist in self-affirmation, to strive to struggle, and by definition, courage requires the presence of danger in order to exist. The contents of my preliminary exploratory research is as follows. I will describe a perspective of agency and subjectivity using contemporary neurobiology as the physiological correlates for such, with reference to Catherine Malabou's work on the concept of neuroplasticity as a viable tool against depression. I will refer to agency in the context of neurological functions as neurological agency. I will then elaborate upon Malabou's work on the effects of trauma and indifference on subjectivity, agency, and consciousness, while further investigating the ontology of other common psychopathologies to articulate them as repressions upon agency and being vis-a-vis their neurological effects, calling it neurological oppression. I wish to explore the nature of neuro-psychological conditions and therefore existential conditions which place limitations on agency and subjectivity. This includes PTSD, depression, and anxiety, but I will also focus on the special place of indifference or apathy with respect to agency and being, and the incidence of indifference with respect to trauma and social phenomenon. I will attempt to understand how agency and being are negotiated or oppressed by psychological phenomena and how circumstances might come to emerge as such. What I am not doing is discussing the neurological or otherwise optimization of health and wellness or a philosophy of happiness. In fact, I would even argue in defense of directly endangering health, wellness, and happiness for the sake of agency and being if necessary. But in any event, I speak on behalf of their deprioritization in modern society. I will further discuss these phenomena in relation to the concepts of fear, courage, risk, and danger, finally using courage as a mode for re-engaging agency and beingness under conditions wherein they are compromised. I will conclude by positing that the routine and intentional seeking and overcoming of danger defends the ability to materialize agency and being against oppression. In the human condition, Hannah Arendt discusses the phenomenon of identity as disclosed by action. The individual nature of being is disclosed through agential actions in the world. Action is how a being materializes its existence. In the Ethics, Spinoza discusses kinatis, beingness in the context of kinatis, which can be translated to the word endeavor. Spinoza says, the endeavor wherewith everything endeavors to persist in its own being is nothing else but the actual essence of the thing in question. He then situates being on a spectrum between sad passions, which diminish the power to act, and joy, which increases the power to act. In The Courage to Be, Tillich reflects on Spinoza's understanding of the core essence of beingness as a striving to self-affirm as its essentia actualis, its actual essence. The kinatis makes a thing what it is, so that if it disappears, the thing itself disappears. Striving towards self-preservation or towards self-affirmation makes a thing be what it is. It is the striving, which is the essence of the thing, also its power. And Spinoza says of the mind that it affirms or posits its own power of action vis-a-vis this process. Tillich thereafter discusses the nature of how kinatis relates to courage as a medium through which kinatis is reified and expressed. We also see the emergence of courage in relation to willpower in Nietzsche's Will to Power. Under this context, courage emerges as the agonist of striving towards self-affirmation, and therefore the antagonist against oppression of being. Catherine Malibu's research employs neuroscience to explore what it might indicate about the nature of subjectivity and agency, as well as such in response to oppression. Her other research also encompasses the effects of brain damage on subjectivity and identity. She develops a manner of correlating neurobiological research, referring to the work of neurobiologist and philosopher Antonio Damasio and neurobiologist Joseph Ledoux, to the theories of subjectivity, agency, identity, the soul, and consciousness with ages-old lineages of philosophical research on these topics. She proposes that neuroplasticity, the means by which the brain learns, relearns, restructures, and develops from birth until death, is the means by which a subject can regain control over conditioning forces which alter neurological functioning, and thereby subjectivity and consciousness itself. In neurobiology, the power to act rests in the brain. In each being, there are relative states of activation of various brain areas. Key functions which affect expression of agency and disclosure of self rest in the neocortex. Neurological oppression, especially depression, and PTSD activate such brain areas. These areas correspond with a sense of self, sense of the body, empathy, executive functioning, and emotional regulation, and more. This reflects a diminishing of self-control and ability to control the mind and body, or in other words, agency. It also cordons the subject from key areas of subjective experience, negotiating access to elements of existence as a being in order to prioritize immediate biological survival. In modern neuropsychology, it is theorized that brain states and body states modulate between a state of quotidian functionality and a state of emergency survival, otherwise known as fight or flight mode. A being slides between the two depending on the immediate demands of existence. Fight or flight maximizes efficiency of biological processes, allowing for an enhanced ability to fight or escape during danger. If fleeing is no longer possible, it can lead to a state of freeze, a total collapse inwards, an evolutionary deactivation mechanism which contrives to render the subject animal as object-like as possible, first reducing brain activity in order to flee without interference of contemplation, followed by the highest possible reduction of movement and sensation so as to decrease the likelihood of exposure to threat, and a numbness so as to render potential death as painless as possible. It is the disappearance of being in the face of paralytic fear. In further writing, I will go deeper through the anatomy of psychopathologies of depression, anxiety, and PTSD. I will also focus on apathy, a common terminal result from chronic exposure to each of these conditions, as well as increasingly modern society. Apathy, lack of interest in the power to act, loss of the power to disclose being, loss of kinatis, loss of beingness itself. In order to demonstrate the neurological correlations of these conditions and how they relate to agency and being, I will divulge my current knowledge of the neurological effects of post-traumatic stress disorder. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk indicates that these areas of the brain which are repressed during fight or flight mode during a traumatic event remain chronically problematic and dysfunctional for people with PTSD, dramatically altering functioning of the brain. Furthermore, studies demonstrate that survivors of trauma are more likely to experience the repression of areas of the brain during normal life. A 2004 study on the default state network, everyday brain activity, by Dr. Ruth Lanius demonstrated that in trauma survivors, the areas of the brain responsible for a sense of self are repressed or deactivated by default, impairing the traumatized person's understanding of themselves on an ongoing basis. Medical issues with no clear physiological cause are ubiquitous in traumatized people as well. This also portrays the potential of trauma to physically disable. In his chapter, Healing from Trauma, Owning Yourself, Van der Kolk writes, when people are forced to submit to overwhelming power, as is true for most abused children, women trapped in domestic violence, and incarcerated men and women, they often survive with resigned compliance. Certain traumatic situations, particularly ongoing cases of oppression, condition the survivor of trauma to respond compliantly to their oppression. This is the creation of Foucault's docile subject or docile body. Trauma can incur loss of connection with the body, what philosopher and psychologist William James referred to as sensory insensibility. The loss of connection with the body, in the case of trauma, can be directly correlated with loss of agency. Not only this, but surviving trauma also augments the effects of Foucault's concept of the gaze as a disciplinary observational force of power and oppression, at least on the level of face-to-face interactions. When Dr. Ruth Lanius studied the differentiation of trauma survivors' brains when making face-to-face contact with a stranger, she found that the brains of traumatized people did not display the curiosity exhibited by neurological activity in the frontal lobe like non-traumatized people. Instead, there was an intense activation of the primitive areas of the brain known as the preaqueductal gray, which generate startle, hypervigilance, cowering, and other self-protective behaviors. There was no activation in any part of the brain involved in social engagement. In response to being looked at, they simply went into survival mode. This is an intense reification of Foucault's theory. It is also true that the augmented effectiveness of the gaze as a force of domination diffuses into other areas of observation and surveillance, unlimited to face-to-face encounters. Could this result in a more docile rejected subject? What does traumatization do to the oppressibility of already socially oppressed groups? Does it make such demographics more easily oppressed and marginalized, resulting in a vicious cycle of increased marginalization and oppression? PTSD becomes a prison of the mind, which collapses around its subject on trigger command. Worse, PTSD, anxiety, depression, and other trauma-related diagnoses are considered to be mental illnesses with reference to the normalizing judgment concept of Foucault as well, alienate and debase the subjectivity of trauma survivors in the eyes of society, further marginalizing and oppressing. When faced with danger, is the subject faced with a choice? A great deal of how a being responds when faced with danger relies upon reflex due to time limitations on risk assessment. A reflex relies on how we have shaped ourselves to exist or how the world has shaped us. In neurobiological terms, this refers to the development of neural pathways in the brain, which fire as patterned by past activity. This would incur that the ability to retain will and agency can be modulated from past choices. The most fitting example of such would be seen in martial arts training. And The Body Keeps the Score, Van der Kolk describes a woman in Oakland, California, who was a 5th degree black belt in karate and was assaulted. It was concluded that despite her advanced training, she was de-skilled by fear. As a result, a program was started in 1971 to decondition the freeze response through attack simulations in fighting classes, wherein students were taught to transform their fear in these scenarios into fighting energy. This is an example of simulated risk and danger practice being used to train resilience of agency in the face of oppression. For my research, I will use this example to examine the differences in training for the martial artist who was attacked and froze versus the types of training which remediated the danger of being de-skilled by fear in the freeze response. I'm still in the beginnings of research, but what I suspect is the principal difference is the ability of the exercises to create a feeling of existential danger and mortal threat to the participants, such as what a person would undergo from both a philosophical and neurological perspective in the event of real danger. In experimental research from the Huberman Lab at Stanford University in 2018, researchers discovered a previously unknown area of the brain. The scientists were examining danger responses. They discovered that when a subject is in danger, a brain component at the very center of the brain called the ventral midline thalamus is activated. Within this structure is another referred to as the nucleus reunions. And therein envelops a cluster of brain cells called the xiphoid nucleus. The researchers discovered in the study that during a dangerous encounter, neurons fired from the ventral midline thalamus selectively into either the medial prefrontal cortex, an area which is repressed during trigger states of PTSD, or into the amygdala, the brain structure activated during flight before a subject freezes in a state of induced numbness or disassociation. When the xiphoid nucleus was stimulated, neurons fired exclusively into the amygdala, inducing a flight and freeze response. When the nucleus reunions was activated, neurons fired into the medial prefrontal cortex, inducing a fearless behavior and inclinations to fight the threat at hand. Contrary to common vernacular, the subjects were in a heightened state of cognizance when they were compelled to fight the threat. The activation of the medial prefrontal cortex could also indicate that this is a state contrary to the neurobiological state of traumatization. It is a state retaining cognizance and agency in the face of oppressive terror. This leads to the questioning of how the reflex of fight or flight or courage versus fear might be engaged prior to existing danger. Was the martial arts training program effectively training their participants to activate the nucleus reunions instead of the xiphoid nucleus? Were they training them to engage beingness, conatus, and courage to be instead of the rapid slide into the objectness of paralytic freeze fear response into loss of agency? If psychopathologies can be defined as aversion to risk and fear of the unknown, and trauma and depression are the hyperactivation of the biological mechanisms which cause the shutdown of agency and self, this leads to the question of whether the concept of neuroplasticity might herein be employed to aid in the recrafting of the brain in such a way that it responds differently to threat and risk. The Huberman Lab is now conducting research into fear and courage and how the ability to make decisions and think logically can be preserved in fear-inducing situations. Essentially, they are studying neurological agency in situations of simulated mortal peril. They hope to gain insight into how to use technology to help people with PTSD and anxiety. They use a virtual reality box, much like the contraption they conceived of previously, wherein the participants are subjected to universal fears, great white sharks, gigantic attacking spiders, an attack dog, great heights, and so on. I wonder what their results will show in relation to a few variables which do not lend themselves to a laboratory setting, but might lend themselves to ordinary quests of risk and danger. One is embodiment, as many situations would satisfy the criteria for danger and risk would involve a physical struggle and endangerment, in addition to the mental fight or will. In terms of agency, as per our end, would this qualify as an instance of action, thereby constituting an expression of agency or disclosure of being? Another is existential meaning. Will this brief laboratory experience of global fears contain the markers of existential meaning necessary for a quest that requires being overcome in order to feel the substantiation of agency and being in the face of danger? To feel created by courageousness in vanquishing over an existential threat. I wonder if the element of submersion in the situation will be enough, considering the short duration, the pre-recorded fear situations, and the lack of physical immersion in the scenario, to create a feeling of identification with the peril to the point where a person feels they are overcoming substantiated danger and proving their identity and worth in an existentially meaningful way. The third concern that I have is the capabilities of this study to surrounding intention. If intentionally seeking danger is important to the affirmation of being through its conquest, then I would be concerned that putting on a VR headset and being subjected to its contents would not amount to be an invocation of such. Malibu also offers us insight into the effect of intention on neuroplasticity in an invocation of the work of Marc Généraux, who's a celebrated neurologist and philosopher. The biological function of intentional action ought to be investigated not as maintaining a constancy, but rather as generating new properties. This research results in a reversal of the concept of the relation between organism and environment. A self-regulated structure can only submit to the influence of the environment, while only a structure capable of self-generated activity could impose its own organization. Intentional movement thus becomes the means by which the organism and the environment reciprocally interact, and by means of which the subject constructs its own representation of the real. Could it feel more like an erasure of identity in that case? The feeling of being impressed upon by an overwhelming force which overtakes. Is this traumatization? Nonetheless, considering the very small amount of scientific research into the area, so intensely interrogated and investigated by philosophy, I look forward to studying their findings. Risk is an understudied phenomenon from a neurological perspective. And when it is generally studied from the lens of risk management in gambling scenarios, or for the purpose of redirecting risk-taking in adolescence. The importance of risk and danger to meaning making, as well as the advocation of self and agency, are known to sociologists and anthropologists, however. It is well established in sociology and anthropology that risk-taking results from a need to assert the feeling of agency and control. In sociological research published in the Journal of Risk and Research, researchers propose that there are three types of risk: risk as an end in and of itself, risk as a means to an end, and risk as a response to vulnerability. Even when there is no material necessitation for risk behaviors, a desire for agency and assertion of identity is often reflexively remediated by risk-taking. This reflex to take risks to encounter danger highlights the importance of risk-taking and facing danger to identity. Despite immense and amazingly ineffective both government and social organizational efforts, ubiquitous in the modern world to reduce dangerous behaviors across social stratas, risk-taking persists as a restoration and advocacy of agency and identity. It is established that subjects experience a sense of agency, meaning, and assertion of self through risk. But is there a neurobiological correspondence which marks the incarnation of this phenomenon? What relation might risk and danger have with neurological oppression? French anthropologist David Le Breton proposes that there are 4 types of risk-taking. One is the risk of sacrifice, to take a smaller loss for the sake of something more significant. Another is dependence, escaping the world by consumption of material products, the race for money, or chemical addiction. The third is what he refers to as le blancheur, which could be translated to mean whiteout, roughly, to depart from one's identity and disappear, an obliteration of the self. And the fourth is what he refers to as l'orthlie, a term which has its roots in the ancient practice of putting oneself through physical ordeals in order to prove oneself under divine judgment. It is a quest to face death in order to overcome it, in which the core of one's existence, life, and identity are called to question. L'orthlie is an act of intentionally seeking out danger, mortal peril, for the purpose of affirming one's place in the universe, reinforcing identity, asserting existence against non-existence. It is also a moment of the creation of subjectivity under the context of courage against existential peril. I wonder what the neurological markers for these states might be and what each portends for agency, being, and consciousness. L'orthlie, it would appear, is the invocation of being through ontological courage. From this cross-disciplinary examination, we can see, or at least I hope that we will start to see through my research, the materialization of Arendt's action, Spinoza's conatus, Nietzsche's will to power, and Tillich's courage to be, through the lens of neuroscience, through the Huber lab, through sociology in the risk analysis from the Journal of Risk Research, and in anthropology through David Le Breton. Tillich's idea of the courage to be frames courage as a force which vivifies our feeling of existence, our sense of being. The moment of courageousness ignites a sense of awareness, a consciousness of beingness itself. In what sense would l'orthlie be a practice in reinforcing a courage response to peril? In the context of neuroplasticity, l'orthlie invokes courage by facing danger. If routinized, this reinforces neural pathways, which are the corporeal correlates to courage. Does it become a practice of courage, a training of resistance to loss of agency, an antidote for loss of will in psychopathology, for mundane apathy, and the loss of being resulting therehence? In what regard, therefore, is danger essential to the invocation of being and agency, and what could neuroplasticity pose as the potential medium for their materialization in the face of threats to their existence? Subsequent to this logic, does it not only position danger as an antidote for ontological oppressors such as trauma, depression, anxiety, and indifference, but as an essential agonist to agency and beingness in and of itself? That's all.
Great. Well, thanks to both of you for fantastic presentations. There are some questions that have been posted, mostly by GCAS researchers already, whom most of whom you already know, maybe all. So I'm asking them to join the Zoom, and you can just they can pose their queries directly to you. Ewa has a few questions. And Eris has a few questions. So we'll just wait for them to join now. And in the meantime, here comes Marie, who's also in Montreal. And so welcome. Great. Excellent presentations. Wow. And yeah, it's okay. There's Marie. All right. Marie, welcome. Yeah, hello, and you're in Montreal, and here comes Sawyer. So, and then Manuel will be joining us from Canada. Also, the Canadians here, the Canucks are taking over here. But great. Sawyer from Denver, Colorado is joining us as well. There's Sawyer. And then we have Manuel. And let's give Manuel another minute or so. But it's great to see other GCAS researchers in on this, and a great idea of exchanging ideas about the presentations, insights, questions, sources, those kinds of things, which are imperative to solid research. But as we wait for Manuel, let's start, by the way, with Sawyer, who posed the first question. So we'll go back to Ewa, and Sawyer wants to ask a few qualifications. Go ahead, Sawyer. Hey, first of all, do you mind briefly introducing yourself, just and then pose your question? Thanks.
Yeah, my name is Sawyer. I'm an MA researcher. Yeah, so Ewa, I have two questions. Very interesting. I think some of the things that you're thinking about in some ways align with the sort of things that I've been thinking about and researching, specifically on the idea of potential. So the first question, you mentioned you're working with Agamben text. I'm just curious what Agamben text you're working with when you're thinking about the metaverse and this sort of like virtual subject and the user and the consumer.
Hey, I think with some people that I know, we have this joke, oh, Agamben has a book about that, when we talk about pretty much anything. But this is from Stanzas. So there are some essays by Agamben, and especially I quoted from one called, I think, Marx or the Absolute Exposition. No, I can send it to you. But from Stanzas, there are a couple that I found especially relevant, where he is talking about Marx and the commodity, and exploring the value of use and value of exchange, also talking about this absolute commodity.
Awesome. Cool. And then my second question has to do with metaverse and the potential, because I think when you said metaverse has this like unlimited potential, I think the word potential is such an interesting point of like thinking about potential for whom, potential for what, and all of that. So I think, as you mentioned, it's considered a place of unlimited potential, and that's sort of marketed from the creators, owners, and shareholders of these metaverse spaces to the users. I'm wondering in your research, like how this point of view or this potential is actualized for the user. Is it just like a flat plane of consumerism, or is there any sort of, I don't know, creative potential for the user, or other sort of potentials for the user other than just consumerism? Or maybe it's that consumerism just sort of undermines any sort of potential. But yeah, I was just curious.
Yeah, good question. I think one term that I mentioned here was prosumption. So I think that the thing is the user think they are consuming, but maybe they are really producing as well. So in that way, they are actualizing. I think the actualization happens through just presence in the space, and that's exactly how the labor happens in that space. So there is perception of this just pure potential and enjoying, but actually there is it's constantly actualized through this labor that is under the veil of this enjoyment.
That's really, so is are you connecting like the presence on digital spaces as being like producing and consuming? Is the producing aspect like producing data, or producing like a map for how people are going to make decisions? Or that's a really interesting sort of.
Yeah, I think there is production that happens just through the presence, because without the presence, in a way, the space, it doesn't exist. I think so. It exists maybe in a binary way of code, but the space, it really kind of it's actualized actually through user interaction.
Thanks, Sawyer, for your queries, and Eva for the response. Manuel is going to join us here. If not, I can read his queries. But in the meantime, why don't we go to Marie, who has some questions for Eris. Go ahead, Marie, and briefly introduce yourself if you don't mind. Thanks.
Hello, I'm Marie. I will be a researcher with GCAS starting soon, I hope. I'm in Montreal. Obviously, it's snowing. It's fantastic. Where's Eris? I want to see you.
Hello.
Hello. So we know each other. But I've been dying to ask you these questions for my own personal research and curiosity. I've been researching the cusp of the Age of Enlightenment and risk-taking practices like mountain climbing and what was happening at that time. And now I'm wondering what that's true.
At what? Sorry, I didn't hear the first sentence you said. At what time?
The Age of Enlightenment.
Oh, okay.
Okay, yeah. Right. So at that time, there's something pivotal that I don't really fully understand. But I believe we're coming to another one of those times. I'm seeing a rise in, especially the people that we surround ourselves with as circus performers, that assertion and the freeing quality of this becoming very important in the consciousness of people. And I'm wondering why. I'm hoping I can find why now, so that when I look back, it will make a little bit more sense.
Mm-hmm.
Because the Age of Enlightenment happened after the technological scientific surge, the age of science.
That's a really interesting question. I'm not sure. I think this is a complicated question, and there's a social phenomena surrounding risk are really interesting. And indifference and apathy and the prevalence of depression is kind of also a contemporary phenomenon that's post-Enlightenment. And when you look at the Enlightenment, you also look at dramatic risk reductions and the heightened level of comfort that people feel in their lives. I was looking at a study at 5 a.m. today, which you would love personally. And it was a neuroscience study on pain and pleasure. And it essentially was looking at the fact that pain and pleasure have similar neural pathways in the brain. And this neuropsychologist was sort of positing to the general populace that if you're avoiding pain, you're also avoiding pleasure. You're shutting yourself down emotionally. You're cutting yourself off. And she didn't say this from a philosophical perspective, but from a philosophical perspective, we would say you're cordoning yourself off from beingness in some way. And I think that you can look at, I'm very skeptical of this optimization of safety and comfort that is of the nature of modern society. And I think a part of the meaning of existing is struggling and risk and danger. So you could definitely, I think if you examined it, which there's a lot to examine, look at post-Enlightenment and I guess industry and capitalism and see a negative relationship between some of these things.
There's a gap there that I found where religion goes in and Puritanism. So this is, but I see a correlation between woke culture and Puritanism right now.
Yeah, my friend was telling me about the beginnings of Puritanism in the United States, of evangelism in the United States, which started in New Brunswick, New Jersey. And they were actually kind of their moral ethics and their stances weren't what you would expect. I don't know enough about it to personally speak to it, but I think you're talking about something here.
Yeah, something's there. Yes.
And I think there's also a relationship between seeking religion and loss of meaning. And I think theology and divinity and religion play an important role in feeling meaning. And I don't think this is always materialized in the most in a way that gives people the most agency, which is unfortunate. And I think with a lot of religion, I think the power of religion in that regard is often hijacked by
politics,
super worldly people, not worldly, super not the religious entities people think they're being taken with, but very material beings that are just humans on this earth.
I see a relation between your thesis and, I'm sorry, I forgot your name.
Ewa.
What we're choosing, choosing religion or choosing an extreme of something, is at the cost of something else all the time. And humans have a tendency to do that, as opposed to choosing a range of experiences and a polarization. Neurologically, that's where it's interesting.
Thank you, Marie. It's great to have you part of GCAS and looking forward to your own research and presentations. Thanks a lot and great. So we've been joined with our last set of questions from another surprise, master's researcher who's actually about ready to fold into the PhD program, Manuel from Alberta, Canada, near Calgary. Manuel, why don't you introduce yourself and then pose your queries? Thanks.
Sure. Yeah. Hi, everyone. Yeah, as Kristen said, my name is Manuel. I'm a GCAS researcher in the MA program. Yeah, and I just had a brief question for Ewa, and I am not sure how relevant this actually is to your research. But I was wondering, would you consider, when talking about metaverse and virtual reality and all that kind of stuff, even this interchange right now, would you, when you talk about production and you talk about different political understandings, I guess, would you consider the development of the metaverse as a sort of a late capitalist response to Marxist historical materialism framework? Would you consider it to be almost as a return to metaphysics in a sense? Moving beyond this, the inherent resource limit of the material world toward a pure, ideal, virtual, in a sense, limitless world. And would you suggest that then this idea of the metaverse is then an ideal, I guess, in a Platonic kind of sense, enterprise, as in we're moving away from, we're moving back, if you will, into a purely metaphysical understanding as a virtual world, living the quote unquote real world behind as of the world of representations or whatever. Yeah.
I think I might be too early in my exploration to really answer that. But I think I just watched a video the other day about how we perceive what we think is the real world and how we can understand it in terms of the interface that we are interacting with. So similarly to metaverse, I think what we think is the real world, we really don't have any idea. And then other than that, I think there's still a lot of work to do to really understand the value of exchange and value of use in the metaverse, and is there any value of use of that kind of commodity in that space. So I am very early in my exploration there, but good question.
Well, fantastic. Thanks so much. This has been a great hour in which two presentations were presented, some queries were responded. I'd like to thank Victoria for the introductions, Ewa for her presentation, and to Eris for their presentation. Also, thanks to Sawyer, Marie, and Manuel, and all of you who have joined us. We wish you a successful and swimming new year. Not successful in maybe the materialist sense per se, but yeah, so we want to thank everyone and looking forward to our next round of presentations coming up next month. So thanks again. And yeah, I'm going to bid adieu at this point. So thanks, and feel free to follow up with any questions you might have. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.